My name is Blakley Davis, and I'm an assistant professor at Virginia Commonwealth University. What really motivated this research specifically was that when I initially started looking at crowdfunding back in my PhD program around 2011, I guess, we really began with the question of why do people give money to these ventures? You know, they don't get anything in return, and there is a very high level of information asymmetry because these entrepreneurs, they don't provide them with any level of financial data. And typically they're very nascent in their development. So it's just like, why do you give these people money? Like it's a nice thought. And from that point, it was kind of, well, this is a nice thought. So perhaps there's something more to it that hasn't really been discussed yet in the literature. And that really drew me to look more to the perceptual elements of the pitch. Now, when you look at existing research within entrepreneurship and management that have really discussed the perceptual elements, they've tended to look at aspects such as the passion of the entrepreneur or perhaps the overall novelty of the business idea. So they have done that. However, in doing so, they typically assume that the resource providers would take a relatively rational approach to evaluating that information. So perhaps a venture capitalist would look at the passion of an entrepreneur, the outwardly visible passion of the entrepreneur, and say, well, that's simply a signal of their dedication, their motivation, their love for this venture. And because of that, I think that this is a sound bet. However, in crowdfunding, given the lack of financial rewards and the financial information, we're like, well, what about the emotional side of this? You know, perhaps these individuals that are providing capital through crowdfunding are actually taking their own emotion, their emotional response to this pitch into consideration. And that's kind of how we got to this point. In terms of the perceptual cues and how we decided to look specifically at product creativity and entrepreneurial passion, we looked at those for a number of different reasons. To begin, we decided to really have our focal variable be the product itself. And that's simply because on Kickstarter and many of the rewards-based platforms, each venture centers around a specific product or a specific service. You know, that's one thing that really differentiates crowdfunding from your traditional funding conduits, which oftentimes will provide just general capital for venture growth. In crowdfunding, it's always to support a very specific purpose. Okay, so that's kind of where we began in terms of focusing on the product itself. Now, obviously there exist a number of different perceptual elements associated with the product. Like it could be really neat, or it could be something that we're emotionally tied to, maybe something from our childhood. However, when you look to the marketing research specifically, one perceptual element continues to stand out and truly differentiates products, and that is its level of creativity. And that's because oftentimes when new products fail, they're simply Me Too products. You know, there's nothing really novel or meaningful there. And in essence, a product's level of creativity, so the extent to which it's novel in relation to existing goods and the extent to which it provides meaning to me as a potential consumer investor is totally up to us. It's perceptual. It depends on what you've been exposed to before. Similarly with the entrepreneur, all types of perceptual elements exist. So if I go out and I meet a person, I'm like, well, their handshake was relatively firm or weak, or I don't like the way this person smells or the way they do their hair or whatever else. Maybe I don't like their tone. However, with entrepreneurs, the most common and perhaps the most, I guess, well-associated perception of entrepreneurs is their passion. When we think about entrepreneurs as scholars and as practitioners, we think about entrepreneurs being very passionate individuals that truly care about the venture that they're starting or the opportunities that they've identified, or perhaps even helping other entrepreneurs by becoming angel investors. So that's really how we focused and settled on those two perceptual elements. So if you look at research in other areas within entrepreneurship or management or anywhere else, something that typically studies will always get hit on is the use of student subjects, right? Because there's not a lot of external validity typically when you use student subjects. In terms of research design, we actually used a student sample, which is really nice within crowdfunding. Something that's unique about crowdfunding is that students actually represent the people that are providing capital through crowdfunding. So what we're able to do is we had access to a group of 200 students at 2 different universities in the US, and we had each of those students view 10 different crowdfunding pitches taken directly from Kickstarter. They'd watch the video, read the pitch, etc. And then they go in and we ask them to answer a series of questions related to their perception of the overall creativity of the product, the passion of the entrepreneur, and their own personal emotional response to that. And this was during the first wave. A week later, we had them come back and provide their investment decisions. And what was really unique about our paper, though, is that oftentimes now, in many of these studies, particularly with crowdfunding, the authors will oftentimes rely on platform-based data. which is great. It's objective, it tells us exactly what happened. But in our instance, it didn't really fit, right? Because we're using students, and when you're talking about these perceptual-based elements, it's all a very individual level decision. So we weren't able to use platform-based data. And rather than simply relying on a Likert scale, which again doesn't give us a really good definition in terms of, how much or how likely am I willing to provide money to this entrepreneur, because a 6 on a 7-point Likert scale is different to me than it may be to you. We are able to instead use dollar amount. And in doing so, I think that also provides a contribution to the entrepreneurship literature as well as the crowdfunding literature, simply because we provided and brought over a method essentially to utilize ipsative data within entrepreneurship. It's not something that's been done very recently, and it's not something that's still very common in academia at large. And essentially what that did is it allowed us to properly utilize simply a set dollar amount. Each student was given $1,000, hypothetical dollars, and they were told to allocate that amongst the ventures in any way that they saw fit. Some of the implications associated with our study are quite interesting. So on the entrepreneur side, one thing that I think really something that I think was very valuable from the findings themselves relate to entrepreneurial passion. So taking it back a step to scholarly research, there have oftentimes been mixed results associated with the relationship between entrepreneurial passion, at least expressed passion, and funding outcomes. We provide a bit of clarity to that though. Basically because we show that yes, passion does in fact influence a resource provider's decision to provide capital, but it's done so through that emotional response that they have to the pitch, right? So we do provide evidence that emotional contagion does occur. Moreover, we also provide evidence that this whole issue of emotion, or perhaps other less rational issues, do in fact come into play in the funding decision. Moreover, we also provide evidence for entrepreneurs that, hey, your product needs to be creative. But at the same time, given the way that we measure creativity, we also provide evidence to suggest that the products need to be not only novel in terms of providing value above and beyond what's currently on the market, but they also need to provide meaning. So people need to be able to easily understand them and understand the value that this new product is providing. Because simply because it's novel doesn't mean it's good. You can eventually become perhaps too novel to the point where you're going to see diminishing returns. What we also found importantly is that having the right combination of passion and creativity can make all the difference in the world. So specifically, we found that having a highly creative product, you get all the more benefit if you as the entrepreneur are highly passionate as well. So if you combine the two, you see a very large return on that. And that's important because not all entrepreneurs are visibly passionate. And that's specifically the type of passion that we looked at. And I think that's important for a number of reasons, but in particular in my mind, it's because not all of us are really that visibly passionate or excited about things. Some of us are introverts. So just because you're an introvert and you sit here with your arms crossed and you're kind of monotone, that doesn't mean that you're not excited about your article, your idea, your venture, whatever. It just means that you don't know how to maybe adequately express that due to personality differences perhaps, or cultural norms or whatever. But what this shows us is that from a practitioner standpoint, that regardless of your personality or the norms that you subscribe to, whatever, then perhaps you could take an acting class, you can take speaking lessons, whatever it is, to help you get to that point to where you can at least display your passion to these external stakeholders. And that's important because, again, that can make all the difference in the world and help you to get all the money that you could possibly need to get your venture off the ground.